Hello, my name is Max Banfield. Welcome to my talk. I am the inventor of the method of treating chronic fatigue. And I developed that method in 1982. Chronic fatigue has since been called the chronic fatigue syndrome, and more recently, long COVID. They're the same symptoms, and my method is now used all around the world to treat those problems. I'm also the inventor of the standing computer desk, and I did that in 1998. And my design has replaced all previous standing desk designs, which were rare because they didn't have any particular value. But my design is now selling at the rate of $6 billion worth a year, and has been called the sit-stand desk revolution. However, you may have got the impression that thousands of people contributed to those discoveries when they didn't. So that's what I'm going to explain, how that all happened. And I'll start by discussing the methodologies that existed before I developed those methods, and I will then discuss my rather unusual qualifications, which enable me to solve the problems that no one else was able to solve. I'll then discuss how I invented the method for treating chronic fatigue, and then how I invented a standing computer desk, and then I'll make a summary and discuss what has happened in the meantime. So, I will begin. People have been suffering from illnesses for tens of thousands of years, and during that time, some have been trying to find cures, and some have succeeded. Despite that, even today, there are still illnesses where the cause isn't known and the treatment isn't effective. So, the search for cures goes on. In the past, if people had illnesses that the physician didn't understand, they were told they were imagining things, and that was called hypochondria. Or they were whinging about trivial problems as if they were serious problems that a normal person wouldn't complain about. Other people sometimes would have illnesses where there's a group of individuals, and that would be called mass hysteria. Well, in the 19th century, there are other ideas that came along, and they included curing problems with such things as hypnotism or the beginnings of psychotherapy. And there were methods of treatment such as rest therapy, where patients were sent to rest home in the hope that that would provide the cure. And there were also forced exercise programs where it was argued that these people were getting fatigued because of lack of exercise and even laziness, and if you forced them to exercise, they would get better. And more often than not, that made people worse. But then it was said that they aren't getting worse for physical reasons, they're getting worse because of the fear of the effects of exercise. So those were the earlier theories, and then later they were saying these problems are caused by the mind and not the body, and they would say people would worry every second of every minute of every day for years and wear themselves out with worry, fear or stress, and that the treatment was psychotherapy to remove the anxiety. And millions of research papers were written along these psychological theories, and they would get things like, if the patient wasn't anxious, instead of saying the theories are wrong, they'd say, these patients are more mentally ill than we thought. Their mental problems are so serious, they're buried into the subconscious mind, and that only psychotherapy could bring these problems to the surface, maybe going back to childhood, and then if that happens, supposedly the patient will be cured. That's what they were saying, but it's not what was happening. patients were not being cured. So those are the sorts of theories along the psychological lines. And then technology came along, x-rays, blood tests, CAT scans. And some doctors are saying, even with the latest and best in technology, we still can't find the cause. And over the period of time, most people, the top researchers in the world, had given up trying to find a physical cause. Everyone, millions of research papers were out there on psychological causes. And then there were experimental treatments with drugs like Valium and barbiturates and electroconvulsive therapy, applying electricity through the brain to try and reorganise thoughts. Deep sleep therapy, giving people drugs to put them asleep for months. Instead of curing, a lot of those people came out senile. And then there was frontal lobotomy, where they cut out the surgically removed part of a person's brain. And those were the sorts of ideas around in the 1970s when I was ill. But I knew my problems were physical and not mental. They were saying, for example, that office workers don't do anything physical. All they do is sit in a chair and lift a borrow, which is as light as a feather. It's impossible for there to be a physical cause. And I knew there had to be a physical cause. And that is what I'll explain how and why in the next part of my talk, which I will now begin. When I was 15 years old, I completed high school. And shortly after that, I was sent a letter from the Adelaide University inviting me to come along to courses on maths, physics and chemistry, science courses. I also was offered a scholarship from a private company to study optometry. It's only a part-time scholarship for Melbourne, and I knocked that back as well. But when I was 19, I went on a leadership training camp for gymnastics, and I met a guy there who said he learned how to do leadership at a course called Group Work at the South Australian Institute of Technology. So I went there. The head lecturer was Irene Holloway, and she'd brought this course from America. It's the first time in Australia. And she said I was suitable for the course, and she gave me the names of 3 organisations that are offering scholarships. The first was from the National Fitness Council of Australia, associated with the Olympics. And I knew one of the 3 people on that committee because I'd met him a few years earlier at school when I was training for the 1 mile event in the school sports day. And they offered me a scholarship, but it was only part-time. The second one was the National Fitness, was from the South Australian Government, the Department of Community Welfare. And there was a full-time scholarship and full-time study on full salary for as many years as I kept on passing exams. And I turned that down. The third one was from the federal government where I worked, and it was for it covered the cost of books and fees and gave me 8 hours off work to attend lectures, and that's the one I accepted. So they're my early qualifications. And we were taught about copyright law. We were taught that when we were writing essays or assignments, we had to use our own ideas. If we used somebody else's ideas and didn't mention their name, that's a breach of copyright. It's fraud. And copyright lasts till 70 years after the original author's death. And that if any student copied another person's ideas, then without acknowledging it, then they would clamp down on them. The administrators wouldn't tolerate it, which meant you'd fail your exams, you'd get a failure on your assignments, and you'd probably be banned from the course. So copyright breach was seriously frowned upon. We're also taught that there's no scientific proof for anything in psychology. For example, Medicine has been around for thousands of years. Psychology has only been around for 100 years. And you can see on an x-ray a broken bone. You can't see anything on an x-ray about how the person's thinking. And that technology probably won't be around for 500 or 600 years, maybe never. So the ideas of psychological cause and psychological theories were all estimates. And the main reason I accept it because the best psychologists in the world said so, so most people just accepted them. It was clear to us there was no scientific basis for them. There were a number of other things I learned about all the psychological theories during that course. Well, a few years later, I'd been getting various health problems. None of them showed up in x-rays and blood tests. And the further time went on, they started to become more numerous and worse as I went along. And a point was reached when nothing showed up x-rays, blood tests. My doctors didn't understand, would shrug his shoulders when I asked about him. He'd asked me if the medications helped. I said they didn't. And that was every time I saw him. I started to see him once every 6 months, then once every 3 months, then once every 2 months, every 2 weeks. Ultimately, I was sent to a psychologist and a psychiatrist. The psychologist said he'd been to university, he could scientifically prove that my pains were mental and not physical. So I thought, I'm going to have to study this myself. So that's why I started studying. There was obviously very poor understanding of my problems. And I had sufficient qualifications and background to start research. And I thought I'd better do that. Try and reverse my deteriorating health. I had the education and personal experience that enabled me to proceed. Between 1978 and 1983, I had 15 essays published in the Australasian Nurses Journal on chronic fatigue and other subjects. And on 1980, I had an essay called The Matter of Framework published, and I've since called it the posture theory. In that theory, I suggested that leaning forward towards a desk, compress the chest and abdomen to cause chest pains, breathlessness, faintness, and fatigue. The symptoms are so closely akin to those of anxiety that that's where the confusion would have occurred. There are 2 causes, and I was correct. The next thing that happened was about 8 years after I started, this is 1982, the head of a fitness research institute invited me to design an exercise program for other people with chronic fatigue to enable them to achieve some of the improvements in their health that I had achieved in mine. And at first, I went there suggesting that I designed the program and his research cardiologist could do the study. But they were too busy, or didn't think it was possible. So he decided to put me in charge of the project. And that project was reported as world first between 1982 and 1983 in the Adelaide News and in most major Australian newspapers such as the Sydney Morning Herald and the West Australian. And I was also interviewed on the ABC radio program by Philip Satchell after they spent a week advertising or promoting that interview 20 times a day as they were, as they said, interviewing a word first scientist. Following that, about 8 years later, the American CDC added the label chronic fatigue syndrome to their official list of diseases, and it had the same symptoms. And I didn't find out till later, but it's obvious they recognise the physical basis of the problem. It wasn't a new label, a new illness, it was a change of labels. And then in 1994, I was diagnosed with cancer and given 2 months to live. It was non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So I decided to write a book on posture and health and sell it to school and public libraries. And it started off as a 20-page booklet, but within 6 years it became a 1,005-page book with 2 chapters of it on chronic fatigue. And in 1998, I invented the standing computer desk because there's a design that has replaced all previous standing desks that were rare and non-existent, and now is in almost every building in the world. Not my desk, but the dimensions that I identified is in all the modern desks, the modern standing desks and desktops. And then I had difficulty getting those ideas accepted at the time, and they only become widely used later. And then I recovered from the cancer in the year 2000 and spent 2 years recovering from the side effects. And because the book wasn't selling, and because the libraries weren't buying it anymore, and it was not accepted, and the newspapers weren't presenting articles about it, I stopped publishing. A few things happened in the next 8 years, and then the British government paid £5 million for a 5-year PACE trial. And in that trial, they studied 5 different types of treatment and ultimately found that one of those treatments was standard medical care, which is essentially drugs and reassurance. Another was forced exercise in the form of graded exercise therapy, which I knew was harmful to people, but they didn't at the time. And another one was cognitive behaviour therapy, which is a form of psychotherapy, one of the many. And then they tested pacing. And the description of pacing was a virtual duplicate of my 1982 method, so it's essentially my method. And they came to the conclusion after 5 years that pacing was the best in the world. Some people have since criticised that method when I said it's my method, but they're not criticising my method. They're criticising the way that PACE trial wrongly interpreted my method. My method actually has valuable benefits and doesn't cause anyone any problems. That was about 2012, round about that. And then I started sending essays to the British Medical Journal, their online version. It's one of the top 4 medical journals in the world, and they published 39 essays of mine in 2 years, roughly 2 years. I might have been a bit longer, between 2013 to 2015. And one of the essays they published was my 1980 posture theory. And another one was the research paper I prepared in 1982 for the method of treating chronic fatigue. I'd sent that to the Australian Medical Journal 30 years earlier, but they rejected it on the grounds that, thank you for sending us the research paper. However, we have many others to consider, and yours didn't make the list. It was just a courteous reply saying it wasn't accepted. But it was accepted by the British Medical Journal in 2014, round about that. So during that time, I solved several more problems. And then the British Medical Journal sent me a letter inviting me to peer review research papers but presented by other researchers in the same field as me. And they referred to me as an expert in the field and wanted me to comment on their work. However, I went to the newspapers and the TV programs and told them that I was now the world expert, and they'd always said if an expert agree with me, they'd publish. And now, even though I was the expert, they still wouldn't publish. So I stopped publishing and haven't published anything since. More recently, in 2022, I was invited to give various talks and produce e-posters for their forums. And in 2022, they accepted the text for my poster, and then they accepted my design. And so I went to that conference in Sydney on healthcare, and they gave me the opportunity of giving 2 brief speeches on the subject. But those are all my old discoveries, nothing new, because as I said, other people will get the credit for it and the financial benefits, and I'll get nothing. So it's not worth my while. So those are my qualifications from quite a few years of research and experience. I'll now move on to give you a more detailed account of how I invented the modern method for treating fatigue syndrome, as it's now called. It's also called Long Covid now, the same symptoms. And then afterwards I'll give, as I've said before, a detailed account of how I invented the standing computer desk, and then I'll give a summary of what's happened since. I will now give a quick account of the symptoms that I experienced, how I knew they were physical, and how I discovered the name of the problem, and then how I began the research. When I was 14, I started getting chest pains. When I was 21, I started getting abdominal pains, and then aches in my left and right kidney. When I was about 24, I was a gymnast. It was easy to do 20-odd somersaults. One day, I felt dizzy after doing one somersault. And that's when I knew I had a rather serious problem, and that it was a physical problem. When I was within the next couple of years, I'd start to feel exhausted. I was getting exhausted very easily. The next few symptoms that would occur would be faintness, and various problems like that. And I noticed that there was no stress involved in any of them. So the first thing I had to do was find out what the name of my condition was, because my doctors didn't tell me. I went through a book, A to Z of Health, got to letter D. I had the Costa syndrome. To save a lot of confusion, nowadays that would be called chronic fatigue syndrome, or long COVID. The same sort of symptoms. It would be chest pains, fatigue, dizziness, faintness, breathlessness, and a range of other symptoms. Depending on individuals, they are generally those same symptoms with many others. So having established what the name of the condition was, I then had to decide how to treat them. And because of my background in sport and gymnastics, I thought if I started off with very light exercise and gradually improved, over a period of months or years, I might regain my normal levels of fitness and be able to involve myself in exertion without any trouble. Well, that was the plan. It became a lot more complicated than that. Because of the various symptoms I had, I thought that if I trained in local parks and collapsed, I wouldn't be nobody there to resuscitate me. But then about a year later, I found out about an exercise program being conducted under medical supervision. And I thought that could be the solution to the problem. So I went to the organisation called the South Australian Institute of Fitness Research and Training and enrolled in their course. And then I found that what they were doing was making me worse. And there are 3 or more aspects which I will now discuss. When I enrolled, they took me into a laboratory where there was a stationary cycle. It had one wheel, was supported by a stand, had a seat on it, and a calibrated brake and some handlebars. 2 lab assistants attached some wires to my chest and limbs, which led to a cardiographic machine that was being supervised by a research cardiologist. They required me to start pedalling when there was no brake on the wheel, and my heart began to pound. And then they said I could rest, and then they increased the brake pressure and had me pedal again. And I asked them if my pounding heart was normal, and they said it was. Well, I knew from previous experience in sport that it wasn't, but I couldn't do anything about it, so they just told me to ignore my symptoms and keep pedaling faster and faster. I had another rest, then they put more pressure on the brake and went through about 5 levels. And by the time I got off, I thought, there's nothing normal about the types of symptoms I was experiencing, but they're telling me they were. So I thought, I'm going to have to do something about this myself, because they obviously didn't understand the problem. I went home and I thought, I'll never go back there again. But then I thought, if I don't, I couldn't see any other solution to the problem. Going to the doctor was out of the question. The pills didn't work. Nothing was helping. So if I did nothing, I couldn't see myself getting healthier. So I went back a week later. And there's an indoor area where we do some light exercise, and then we went out onto an oval. There would have been between 30 and 50 people in the group, and we were required to do 2 laps of a 400-yard track. I thought I probably won't make it, but maybe if I go slow and keep to the back of the field, I'll be all right. Well, within about 100 yards, some of the runners were way up ahead of me, running in single file. Then there's a bulk of the group, and I gradually dropped back to last position. One person dropped back to keep me company, and I told him he didn't need to do that, but he had to get fit in his own way. He was an overweight 40-year-old asthmatic, and he ran ahead of me. When I was running last, I was about 25, 26. A young bloke on the side who was the instructor told me I had to think positive, run fast and catch up to the others or I'd never get better. And by then I was looking at him rather sarcastically, as if to say, don't be ridiculous. Now, if he'd have told me to run fast again, I probably would have gone home and never gone back. But he didn't say that again. Just briefly, it was hopeless. I had to stop and start. And when I got three-quarters of the way around the first track, everyone else overtook me. And they'd finished the 2 laps and gone inside and gone home before I'd even finished the first lap. So that's the sort of situation I was in. And it was an extreme struggle for me just to do that. So that's the first problem I had. Nobody in the laboratory understood the problem, and nobody on the track understood the problem, and I just had to struggle through. There's a lot of things I had to do, milder exercise, where I had to change everything. Unfortunately, I had a lot of experience in gymnastics and sort of things like stunt work, where you have to do a lot of experiments anyway, so it wasn't unusual for me to be making changes. But then one day, we had a relay. And to give a rough account of that, let's say there was about 30 people, and that's 5 teams of 6. And all lined up side by side, 6 deep. And when you're running in a relay, you got 5 other people tell you, run fast, come on, we'll make it, we'll win. And all that enthusiastic goading of me to run meant that when I was trying to run and make it look like I was running fast, when I couldn't, I actually ran too fast. And I collapsed on the ground. And I was rolling around the floor. My heart was pounding like an earthquake, and I was dizzy and faint and crawling around on all fours. It took me about 20 minutes before I had enough energy to get up on a chair. And I told everyone else to go away and don't bother trying to help me because it was hopeless. And then I went home. I was home for a week. I was exhausted. And I thought, what am I going to do? If I don't go back, I've got to go to the doctor. And it was obvious he couldn't help. So I thought, I'm going to have to go back. But I'll never, ever do that again. I have got some kind of physical limit. And that is one of the most important discoveries I made, that I've got a limit to how much I can do before I collapse. And as long as I stayed within that limit, I should be all right. So that's what I did. So the next thing that happened is I increased my level of exercise from twice a week to 3 times a week at the Institute venues. And then I increased that to 4, 5 and up to 7 times a week by doing additional training each day in local parks, because I'd established a way of doing it safely. But then one day I injured my knee, and that was poorly diagnosed as well. So I stopped training. I couldn't train anymore because of the knee injury. It was a torn cartilage, but it hadn't been diagnosed. So I essentially couldn't do anything because the knee would keep locking on me. And I didn't understand it for a while after that. So that's what happened. That period of time, I established that you can't run fast, you can't train like an ordinary person. Thinking positive is a waste of time. I had to do things at my own pace, and I had to stay within my limits. It's a lot more complicated than that, but that'll do for now. Well, over the next few years, I was still getting extremely exhausted several times a year, and I wasn't doing much. I wasn't doing any exercise other than walking. So I wondered, why was I getting exhausted just doing practically nothing? So, for example, let's say I was exhausted for 3 months in a row, and then the following year I was exhausted for a couple of months in a row. What was making me exhausted? And that is a very complicated process of evaluation, where I eventually realised that I had to change everything in my lifestyle. Quite complicated, too complicated to go in here. But within 3 years, I'd been able to stabilise my health. So I knew how to exercise, I knew how to adjust my lifestyle to minimise these symptoms, to avoid the major problems I was having. So by then I'd learned the medical language and I was reading research journals. And it was obvious that nobody else in the world knew what they were doing. And I came across this book, and it referred to the world's top researchers, who were Paul Dudley White and Manderley Cohen. Paul Dudley was Harvard Professor Emeritus in America, and University Professor, a really top researcher, had a lot of useful information, did a lot of research himself for about probably 50 years on this subject, but he couldn't get his patients to train for 12 weeks. he wanted to get physical data on the effect of 12 weeks training. Every one of his patients dropped out, and I knew exactly why. But I didn't know how to contact him. And so that was that. Until about 8 years after I started, a friend of mine said he knew the head of the institute where I trained, and he insisted I go to see him. So I did. I made a phone call and made an appointment to see him. And when I got there, I basically said, I know how to solve a major medical mystery, and it will be a straightforward project where I'll give you the guidelines, I'll write them up for you, and you can do a study of those patients, and you'll get results that no one else has ever been able to get. And he said, I know you can. I said, how do you know? He said, because he's been to his filing cabinet where my file and thousands of others were kept. He took it out and he looked at what I'd done for 12 months. And he knew I could solve a problem that no one else in the world could solve. So I said, well, can you get your research cardiologist to run the project? And if they will, I'll design the program. 2 weeks later, he got back to me. He said they're not interested in running the program. Come in and see him. And told me. I said, well, we'll see you later. I've got better things to do. And then he said, why don't you run the program? I said, because I've got no medical qualifications. So he said, but you can organise a group. And that's true. And he said, put together a committee of medically qualified people, then you can get government authority and approval, ethical approval and everything, because it'll be the committees responsible for the research. And as long as qualified people say, yes, you know what you're talking about, and yes, this is safe, then everything will be okay. And I thought, how am I going to recruit the people for, what doctors are going to work for me? And he said, well, he'll be on the committee. The 2 research cardiologists he'll recruit, they can collect the data. The 2 lab assistants, they're employees of his essentially, they'll be involved. And he'll get me to recruit a doctor. And he recruited a psychiatrist. Now, I didn't want a psychiatrist on the board because it could be very misleading. And I didn't have anything against the guy, but ultimately he stayed on the committee. I thought about this for a week, and I thought, I don't want to do all that. I don't need to do this. But then I thought, if I don't, it's going to be another 500 years before anyone else figures this out. So I better do it. And a couple of other people I went to. Professor Tim Morrell is the head of Adelaide University Medical School. He's also the head of the Department of Community Medicine. And I went to see him, and he gave me a list of doctors to consult, to see it, to interview, to see if they'd be interested in being on the research project. And I found one. He also wrote a number of notes about my research, which I still have. He said that chronic fatigue wasn't due to any physical problem. He said it's due to people being constantly under stress. And that was just a reflection of all the standard medical opinions were around at that time. So I saw Professor Tim Morrell and got another doctor. We had a committee of 6. So we're ready to go. Then I had to draw up the guidelines, a list of instructions like do everything at your own pace, stay within your limits. If you get problems, take time off and come back. I'm not going to go into any more details, but that's what I developed in a lot more detail. And I said to the instructor, if you have any problems, ring me, I'll tell you how to solve the problems. 3 months later, several people had made 12 weeks training. Another 3 months went by and they'd kept going, and new people had come in and they completed the course as well. that was enough to prove it was possible and to improve it, to prove that it was possible to improve health that way. And I'll say no further matter on it. But I had developed the world's first precisely designed effective method of treating chronic fatigue that no one had been able to do before. And I knew it would change the world eventually. It took a long time. So then I decided I had other problems to solve. And so I told Tony I was leaving the course, but he could keep the guidelines. And that's my copyright, obviously. And he could use it for free for peer review purposes. But if anyone wanted to use it in exchange for fees as a treatment method, it should contact me and let me know. Well, I'd make the appropriate arrangements, which are license fees and royalties. And the same thing goes for anyone who gives lectures on it. So that's how I developed the initial method of treating chronic fatigue. In 1998, just 4 years later, the CDC of America added the label chronic fatigue syndrome to their official list of diseases. It's the same symptoms and it reflects the physical nature of the problem. Between 1994 and 2000, I wrote a 1,000-page book called The Posture Theory. I included 2 chapters on chronic fatigue or related to chronic fatigue. And then in 2007, I started commenting in Wikipedia. In 2008, I wrote about the Costa syndrome, and an editor there, in order to discredit me, said that I only played a minor role in an insignificant study that had no influence on anybody decades ago. Then they used the ignore all rules policy to ban me so that I couldn't say any more. But I noticed in there many pages had information about my research in there, including those on chronic fatigue syndrome and pacing, where at the bottom of the page they had a list of references of a dozen people who supposedly were commenting on the topic. They weren't mentioning my name and they had nothing to do with the research. And then between 2008 and 2012, the British government paid £5 million for a PACE trial. 5 different methods of treating it were involved, and they found that pacing was the best in the world, and that was my method. But of course nobody mentioned my name, and they didn't consult me to tell them how to do it properly. Between 2013 and 2016, I had 39 essays published in the British Medical Journal, and one of them was the 1982 research paper. Probably I did the research paper in 1984 and submitted to the AMJ, Australian Medical Journal. They didn't accept it, but it was accepted by the BMJ in 2013. And then then I went to the newspapers. As I've said before, they didn't want to publish anything about it, even though the BMJ had referred me to as an expert in the field and invited me to do peer review of other people's research on chronic fatigue. And the reason I stopped publishing is because the people who did none of the research and took none of the risks and getting all the financial benefits are being given the credit, and so it's a waste of my time publishing anymore. In the meantime, these my instructions, my guidelines, have been referred to as CFS guidelines, and they're used to treat chronic fatigue. More recently, the label of Long Covid has been added to various lists in relation to COVID, the long-term after effects. The symptoms are the same as chronic fatigue syndrome, and now instead of sending people to mental hospitals for psychotherapy, they're sending them to long COVID clinics where they are specialising in treating it, and the treatment methods are essentially my guidelines. So that's what happened, and that's how I developed these modern methods. I will now move on to the next section, which is how I invented the modern standing computer desk. I will discuss this in several sections, but two main subsections. The first is from the time I got chest pains at age 14, and then from the time I began doing medical research to find out the causes from the age of 25. When I was 14, I started getting chest pains, and I went to the GP, the family general practitioner, and I told him about it, asked him what the cause was, and he didn't know. So a few x-rays later, he still didn't know. And then a year or so later, I was sent to a heart specialist. He gave me a cardiograph, and he said he couldn't find anything wrong. And I asked him if leaning forward could have anything to do with it. And then he asked me a few minutes later to go over to the corner of the room and bend down and touch my toes. When I stood up, he said, "Did that cause any pain?" I said, "No." And he said, "Get out of my clinic and don't come back. I've got a lot of little old ladies who need my help with heart disease, and you haven't got anything wrong with your heart." He was trying to reassure me, but I think it's a bit irrational. I said, "Could leaning forward cause the pain?" And he said, "Tell me to bend forward and touch my toes." And I said it didn't make any sense to him. Well, the fact that leaning forward at a desk might have caused it, and leaning to touch my toes, two different actions, so it didn't make sense to me. But he couldn't explain it. I now go forward to when I was about 20, and I started getting abdominal pain. It was rather obscure. And then I started getting aches in my kidneys around about 11 o'clock after I started work in the mornings. And as the years went by, I started getting kidney aches at about 10 o'clock. And by 2 in the afternoon, I was getting aches in the left kidney and then the right kidney as well. But nothing showed on CAT scans, though one small kidney stone did pass. So that was, as far as that was concerned, there was no cause for that. And then when I was about 24, I was a gymnast and I could easily do about 20 somersaults in half an hour without any trouble at all. But on this occasion, I landed and felt dizzy. That's the first time in 10 years of gymnastics I'd ever felt dizzy doing something as easy as a somersault. And I thought there's something wrong. That's when I knew there's something physically wrong with me. And from then on I started getting problems with faintness and dizziness, a range of other symptoms. And my heart would be pounding walking along the street, and within 10 minutes of sitting at a desk and writing, I'd be in pain. And medication wasn't working, my doctors couldn't explain it, nothing on x-rays. A psychologist said, caused by my mind and not my body, and I knew he was wrong. I knew that from my own education there's no scientific basis for that, so I thought I'm in big trouble, I better do my own research. And that's when I began. Now I start on subsection 2 of this aspect of the standing desk. First of all, I had to figure out what the cause was. And within the next few years, I started thinking about how leaning towards the desk could be the cause. Because I could lean towards the desk, it didn't do anything. But after a while, I'd start getting problems. And ultimately, I noticed these things. Leaning towards a washing machine would sometimes make me feel faint. Leaning towards the kitchen sink would sometimes make me feel dizzy. Leaning down to clean those windows would sometimes make me feel exhausted. So ultimately, whilst it wasn't happening every time, and whilst I was being accused of having inconsistencies, I was looking for evidence of what was going on here, and I saw a very definite pattern. There were definite patterns where leaning forward could be the cause of any of those symptoms. And then by 1980, I was already able to write an essay I called it the matter of framework. And basically the framework of the body relates to the framework of symptoms and so forth. And I called that, ever since, the posture theory. And because I called it a theory, people said it's only a theory. Well, it's probably one of the best theories ever written. I could have called it a posture fact. But the difference between fact and theory is fact is something you can scientifically prove. And at that early stage, I couldn't prove it. So I called it a theory for me to keep working on anyone else, but no one else worked on it. So that was published in the Australasian Nurses Journal. They published about 15 of my essays, and they're all, most of them related on these symptoms, or all of them were, but most of them were related on the symptoms that I was studying: an essay on chest pain, an essay on abdominal pain, an essay on faintness, etc. So I'll go through to a few years later, when I was in so much pain and so desperate to get rid of it that I went to see a gastroenterologist. And I said, I want you to cut my belly open me up and have a look. And he said, he's not going to do it. I said, why not? And he said, because tens of thousands of operations like that are done on people like me. They never find anything. So I insisted he do it anyway. And an hour after the operation, I woke up, I had a massive scar in my belly. I said, what did you find? And he said, nothing. There's no point arguing him, he couldn't find anything. So I was still in pain, a lot of it, and it was a mystery. Well, in 1994, I was diagnosed with cancer. 2 months to live, no hope of a cure. That was non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And as I mentioned before, I spent 6 years writing a book. It became 1,000 pages. And sold it to school and public libraries, copyright, all rights reserved, so that no one else could say they thought of these things. But what I did was I started sitting up straight, throwing my shoulders back. Sounds great, but it didn't help. And there were certain practical aspects to that. And I suggested to other people, they said, no, that doesn't work. So out of necessity, I thought, I'll add a platform to my desk, 6 inches high on top. And that didn't help. So I kept on writing, kept on pain, leaning forward after a short period of time. And then I had an angled platform on it. Well, you'd think that'd help, but it didn't. But it seemed to vaguely improve things. And then I bought a computer, and you can't type on an angled platform. So I removed that and put a 6 inch high platform on it. And that didn't help. So this went on for a few years. And then I bought another computer. I was still writing my book. I was still in pain. I had another platform with a keyboard tray that would slide in and out, so I could adjust the position of the keyboard. And by then, there are several platforms on top of my desk and a keyboard and a computer on top of that. And then one day I was typing for 3 hours. And I stopped and I suddenly thought, I'm not in pain. I'm going to be rich. This design has to be precise or it's not going to work. That solved all the questions I've been asking myself. So I made sure I didn't tell anyone. I wrote it all out, drew a scribbled diagram. The position of the head, the arms, and the screen are in proportion. And that, regardless of what anyone ever tells you, is the reason they're making a lot of them now. Doesn't matter what the desks look like, if they're not in that proportion, they're no use to. And that's where the sit-stand desk revolution comes from. That position. If you look at standing desks now, they're all completely different than those that went before, and they're all precise. So 10,000 people are taking out patents and say they invented it, when in fact I invented it. I understood if they did that, they're breaching copyright before they even walk into the patents office. But people argue that's not the case. Well, it is. So that was how I invented it and how I discovered it, from thousands of experiments over a period between 1975 and 1998, 23 years. You can take out a patent in 2 weeks, and thousands of companies have done it. So from then on, in 1999, I went to the newspapers, they weren't interested. I went to the TV programs and they weren't interested. I went to the universities. Psychologists said I was wrong, and I couldn't sell the book to libraries anymore. They weren't buying them. So I stopped publishing. So that's what the situation was when I invented it. No one was interested. The furniture company said their customers never asked for standing desks, and it'd be too expensive to set up just to take a risk on something new, and I didn't have medical backing, so they weren't interested. Another 7 years went by, and someone said I should put my theory in Wikipedia. Well, I did. And everyone was helping for maybe a month. And then I told the person who reviewed my book for me, to add in the word hypochondria. That's what these symptoms were previously called. And that meant that my theory was replacing the old psychiatric theories. And within about 5 hours, 6 editors come in, delete, 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 speed delete, speed delete, speed delete. This is just a fringy kook, this is just one guy's theory. They wanted to get rid of me so that nobody realised that my ideas would replace those old psychiatric theories. Presumably they were anonymous psychologists editing Wikipedia. And a year later they did the same thing. They found all sorts of absurd reasons for deleting my logical ideas and replacing them. Their idea that they wanted people to believe is poor posture is caused by sadness and good posture is caused by pride. And they were saying my ideas were wrong, that poor posture is caused by a lot of other things, such as poor diet when you're young produces poor bones and the tendency for the spine to slope in a forward direction under the body weight. So that was Wikipedia. They said, I'm the only guy in the world who thinks it, and I'm a fringy kook. Well then, a few years later, I went to start writing essays for the British Medical Journal, as I've said before. And one of them, the earlier ones I published, was the posture theory. And others were on the cause of chronic fatigue, treatment of it, and on the cause of various other symptoms. And then, as I said before, I had 39 essays published in about 2 years, 2013 to 2016. And I was asked to peer review other editors who were writing in about their ideas on health to make sure they were high quality. And I went to the newspapers and I said, I'm now the world expert, will you publish my theories? They said no. And within a few months, Malcolm Turnbull installed a standing desk in his office to bring status and prestige to Parliament House. He was the new Prime Minister of Australia. And then Barack Obama said they were installing $700,000 worth of standing desks into the White House. And I saw evidence that people are on Get Australia Standing, Get America Standing, Get Europe Standing, Get UK Standing campaigns all around the world. They wanted my ideas introduced really quickly because in the past, all these diseases were going untreated with the methods that didn't work. Now I had a way of preventing and treating those illnesses in office workers. Put standing desks in there for those who need them. The government in Australia, for example, was reimbursing the fees of physios and doctors who prescribed them. But they weren't paying me 5% royalties before they gave those fees out. So then I noticed they installed standing desks in the new science building in North Terrace, and they installed standing desks in the new Royal Adelaide Hospital. And it's recently closed down Glenside Mental Hospital, and I've been there since. It's been replaced with an acting and an art studio, and there's standing desks in the reception area. The libraries where I used to go now have standing desks in them, but my book's been deleted from them all as far as I could see. And the furniture companies have been referred to as the world's leading authorities on the new $6 billion sit-stand desk revolution, and sales have gone from almost nothing in 2014 to $6 billion a year by 2020. Now, you can see standing desks was in almost every place now. University, schools, businesses, shops, and places of entertainment. They were rare before. And they're not all standing computer desks. Some are standing computer desks, tops. You put a little platform on top to my design. And some of them are standing desks. And they're just ordinary tall tables. And I didn't invent tall tables, but they never used to be in practically every shop in the world before, as they are now. They never used to be in every building, as you can see them so prolifically now. They're just occasional. And the reason for that is because it's a spin-off from my theory, my desk and my desktops. So some furniture companies are making my entire desk tall, height adjustable for people of different heights. Well, making height adjustable desks is 10,000 leverages and hydraulics and so forth, all sorts of ways of making it height adjustable. There's two ways of copying my design. One is to tailor-make the desk for every individual, and the other is to make them height adjustable so that people can adjust it to suit themselves. They're all using my design. So, having said that, I'll let you elaborate on all the other variations on it. Before, there were rear desks. They were tall platforms who you would call benches. Or they were tall, maybe lecterns, but they were not the design that I made. The design that I made has changed the way furniture companies make the desks. And so I'll end my talk here. And I'd like to thank you for watching this video from start to finish to gain a good overview of the type of research I've been doing since 1975 and how I developed the methods for understanding and treating various illnesses that affect at least 300 million people. Those methods did not exist when I started in 1975. I would also appreciate it if you would tell your friends to watch this video from start to finish to gain the same overview, and to tell anyone you may know who has these types of ailments, because most of them don't even know that I exist. Thank you.